Imagine if all of a sudden nobody paid attention to you. That's what happened to this guy when he woke up as a ghost. Now he has to figure out why this happened and try to talk to other people. It all starts with a group of folks having dinner outside a house. They're celebrating a guy named Nick. His mom is making a speech and mentions that Nick's dad is late. Nick gets up from the table, goes to cut a cake with his face on it, then enters the house. He sits down, holds a gun to his head, but just before he pulls the trigger, he wakes up. It was all just a dream. Now he's having breakfast with his mom, and he's not too happy about the breakfast. Nick asks his mom about a writing course in London that he wants to attend, but she doesn't seem to support the idea. He changes his happy expression to a sad one. Next, he's riding his bike to school. At school, he trades homework for someone, and his girlfriend asks him if he'll come to a party, but he can't because he's busy. Then, there are these three people trying to get money from a guy who owes them. The leader of the group threatens the guy with a knife, but only ends up scratching his finger. Later in Nick's class, a student is reading his homework to everyone. The teacher asks Nick to read his work, and even though it's good, his classmates seem bored. When the bell rings, everyone leaves the classroom and goes to the cafeteria. The guy who got scratched, Nick's best friend Pete, is there. Nick tells Pete he should stand up for himself and not let others push him around. Pete says he can't do something, so Nick steps up to help his friend. Nick pays off Pete's debt. He secretly tells Annie that Pete is really messed up for thinking he could get away with it. Annie doesn't wait long. She attacks Pete, landing some punches on his face. Now, both of them are in trouble and waiting to talk to the principal. They have a serious conversation. Annie tells Pete he's not better than her because he sells essays. He admits he's a hypocrite. The principal arrives, sends Annie home, and talks to Nick. The principal tells Nick not to waste time on people like Annie who don't have a good future. Nick just wants to leave. Later, Annie is at home. Her stepmom made dinner for her brother. Annie confronts her stepmom, leading to an argument. At Nick's house, Pete comes over and teases Nick about getting beaten up by a girl. Nick talks about leaving for a writer's program in London, without even telling his mom. He's tired of his mom always controlling everything. Next, Annie gets into a car with her boyfriend Marcus. They're going to rob a jewelry store. Marcus smashes the glass, takes jewelry, and they speed away in a Mercedes. The next morning, Nick gets ready for school and plans to leave with a bag. Marcus asks Annie to leave the bag, but she refuses. Marcus tricks her by calling the police on his phone. At school, we see Annie taking a bag and putting it in her locker. When she closes her locker, she notices Pete giving her a mean look. A little while later, the police arrive, open her locker, find a valuable item in the bag, and take her away. She calls Marcus from the police station and tells him what happened. He asks if she knows how they found out, and she says she does and will handle it. After the call, she leaves the police station, ready to get back at the person she thinks told the cops about her. Now we see Pete saying goodbye to Nick with a hug. Nick goes home, where his mom has learned about his changed flight details for his trip to London. She confronts him, and he apologizes, explaining he wanted to talk to her about it. She's upset because he's had the ticket for weeks and was going to leave without telling her. She feels like he's a stranger. Nick prepares to leave, taking a watch and putting it in his pocket. Meanwhile, Pete is walking fast when suddenly someone punches him. It's Annie's accomplices. They bring him to Annie, who believes he's the one who informed the police. So she starts hurting him to make him confess, even though he's innocent. The pain becomes too much for Pete, and he falsely claims he'll tell her who did it. And the surprising answer is his best friend Nick. But let's try to understand his reasoning. He didn't intend to betray anyone. He just thought Nick would have left the country by then, and Annie wouldn't have anyone to hurt. Unfortunately, Nick's flight got delayed, so he's at a party, asking his girlfriend if she wants to go to London. While they were hanging out, he tossed her their ticket and told her to enjoy herself. It seems that his mom's talk made him change his mind. Now he doesn't want to go anymore, which isn't good news for anyone. On his way back home, a car starts chasing him. The car forces him into a ditch. It turns out to be Annie and her friends. They start beating him up. Then Pete gets out of the car and tries to explain himself, but no one listens. Pete lifts Nick up and asks who's weak now. Nick still says it's him. They seem to admire someone who's brave. Nick's courage is now gone, after more punches and a strong kick to his face, which ends up killing him. They proceed to hide his body in a hole. While doing this, Nick's watch falls, but no one notices. I used to be able to forgive Pete, but not anymore. How could he be part of that? He was supposed to be Nick's closest friend. Anyway, Nick goes home and confesses to Marcus. She admits to attacking the person who betrayed her. You can see a mark on his face from a gunshot, as he knows for sure that the person she attacked wasn't the actual betrayer. Now he's questioning why she came to him, knowing that he's on parole. He asks Annie why she came here and then sends her away. She feels let down, but just wait until she finds out that he's the one who betrayed her. She vents her anger by breaking things in his workshop, gives him a sarcastic kiss, and leaves. The next morning, she burns the clothes she wore last night. You won't believe what happens next. Nick emerges from the woods, looking untouched, clean and fresh. He walks to school, enters a classroom, but here's the twist: no one can see him. He's invisible, relatable, like no one knows he's there, even though he's sitting right in front of them and can hear everything they say. This gives them the chance to express their thoughts about him, even his girlfriend. She thinks he's acting superior and always trying to seem important. She's skeptical about trusting girls, and now she doesn't trust anybody since even his best friend turned on him. At the beginning, he believes that some people are just playing around with him, but then he grabs a book and throws it at a shelf. But the book doesn't actually move from the table. Afterward, he goes to the school office to call his mom. He's writing on the principal's face, but the principal can't see him. It's like he's invisible, kind of like John Cena. He shouts to his mom, but she can't hear him because she's talking to detectives about him. He heads home, and on the way, he accidentally bumps into someone in the hallway. He even gets hit by a car and run over by a truck, but nothing happens to him in real life. When he gets home, he sees detectives all around his house, trying to find him. He tries to tell his mom that he's dead to make her stop worrying, but she can't hear him. Now he's just walking around the streets, feeling lost. He thinks that if he knew he was invisible, he'd do more than just wander around. The detectives, Brian and Kate, are making progress in their investigation. They talk to the principal, who says that Nick had a fight with Annie, so they go to Annie's house. Brian knew Annie when she was little because her dad used to be a police officer. They question Annie about what she did last night, and Nick is there, listening to her lies. Annie admits that she got angry at Nick because she thought he told on her. In a fit of anger, he tries to push her off the roof, but it doesn't work since he's invisible. The detectives organize a search in the woods where Nick's body was supposedly left. Annie calls someone named Pete and tells him to come there. When Nick hears this, he gets upset. He's in his room and sees his mom going through his things. She reads a poem he wrote, and he reads along with her. His pet bird is there too, and he holds it, but it disappears after a while. This makes him realize something important. He says, "I'm alive," and rushes to the place where his body was left. He tries to get the search party to find him, but he's not successful in getting their attention. The dog, however, seems like it might have seen him, but it turns away at the last moment. The dog helps find Nick's watch. Now, Peter is telling Annie and the others what happened. Peter feels like they will soon be discovered, so he decides to report to the police. He tells them that if he reports, he might also go to jail. Meanwhile, Nick is at a place, listening to everything. He sneaks back into a girl's house. She's trying to pack her things and run away. Victor wakes up and asks if she's leaving forever like their mom did. That's really sad, and he's crying. She might seem tough, but she cares about Victor. She tells him to be different from her, which is good advice. Then, her dad enters the room and tells her to leave. She agrees, but warns that if anything happens to her little brother, she'll be back and confront him. She leaves the house. Nick talks to himself again, saying her difficult family situation doesn't excuse her actions. The search in the woods gets more intense. We see helicopters and an ambulance. A professional person says if Nick is alive out there, he won't last more than a few days. We see Nick's body, and his fingers move. He's alive. Detective Brian goes to talk to Marcus. He asks if Marcus was with Annie on Tuesday night. Marcus says yes. Brian asks about the night Annie robbed the jewelry store. Marcus denies knowing anything about it. Brian knows Marcus has been on parole for 8 months, but he doesn't push it. He gives Marcus his card and asks him to contact him if he sees Annie. Brian wants to talk to her about a missing person at her school. Brian also hints that he knows the exact type of car stolen the same night as the jewelry store robbery. Nick talks to his mom. He knows his words won't change things because his mom always thinks she's in control. He yells at her and makes a mess, but nothing major happens. Later, his mom breaks down and cries. She calls out Nick's name. Pete is walking in the rain when Marcus suddenly appears, holds him at gunpoint, and says the police are following him. Marcus takes Pete into the woods and shows him where a body was left. The next day, Marcus tries to trick Annie into coming somewhere, but she figures it out and sends Pete instead. Pete goes and is followed by Detective Kate. After Nick tries his best to wake her up, Annie heads to a bridge where Pete is talking to two guys. Annie watches from a distance. Suddenly, Marcus sneaks up on her with a gun. He takes her to the bridge where the other guys are. He sends Pete home, and the cops arrive, surrounding them. Ethan aims a shotgun at the cops, but they're trapped. Annie is really good at surviving tough situations. She escapes from a guy named Peter. If Peter knew, he'd be proud like Spider-Man. While she's running away, a guy named Nick yells after her. She might have hurt Nick because she yells back at him. Later, Annie goes to a club and sells a ring that used to belong to someone named Marcus. She takes off her clothes and starts dancing. The next day, she visits her mom's grave and apologizes. Nick talks about how he wishes his mom had died instead of his dad, because his mom puts a lot of pressure on him. He reaches out to Annie and touches her shoulder, saying he knows she can hear him. He asks her to tell them where his body is, but Annie just leaves. Nick follows her. She goes to her school at night, leaves money for someone named Victor, and puts it in her locker. Nick is dying and he tells Annie she's the only one who can save him. He screams her name, but she can't see him. She's sad. She takes a shower and Nick is there, but he's in a hole somewhere. He wakes up on a basketball court. Meanwhile, Annie is looking at Nick's old photos at their house. It seems like they might be falling in love. But Nick's mom interrupts and stops any romantic feelings. Nick runs out and goes to the woods where they put his body, but his body is gone. Nick tells Annie that someone moved his body and asks her to think about it. She sees some things she found with a guy named Pete earlier and realizes Pete must have been there. She goes after Pete at school. Pete tells her that Nick didn't betray her in the first place. Then he admits that he and Marcus moved the body. So she chases after Marcus. She surprises him in his car outside a police station. She takes him to the edge of a cliff and tells him to kneel down, a role reversal. Then she aims a gun at him. Meanwhile, Pete is trying to erase himself. Nick is pleading with him not to do it, but Pete can't hear anything. Here's the interesting part. While Pete is in that in-between state, not fully dead but not fully alive either, he sees Nick. They can see and talk to each other. Nick asks Pete where he moved the body. At the same time, he's asking Marcus the same question. They both answer at about the same time. After they talk, Pete's parents rush into his room and see his condition. Annie leaves Marcus and goes to find Nick. But it turns out to be a bad idea, because Marcus gets up and shoots her. She survives and shoots him back. She contacts Detective Brian, tells him where Nick is, and says she has something for her brother in her locker. She asks Brian to make sure Victor gets it. The police hurry to the dam where Nick's body is. However, Nick reaches his body before them. He touches his own body, but he can't save himself. The dam gates open, and Nick starts drowning. Kate calls for the gates to be closed. Now the police are searching for Nick. Brian finds him, and they all go there quickly. Surprisingly, he's alive. They rush him into an ambulance. Annie is there, watching from a distance. She's still bleeding. Later in the evening, a police officer wakes her up in her car. The officer asks her to get out of the car, but instead, she drives away just as expected. They thought they might start chasing her while she was at the hospital. Nick's mom watched as the doctors tried to save her son. Finally, the police surrounded Annie with guns pointed at her. But she heard Nick's voice in her mind saying he needed her. That was all she needed to hear. She pressed the gas pedal and drove through the police blockade. She left her car behind and continued on foot. Where did she go? To the hospital, of course. Nick guided her to where his body was being operated on. When she got there, Nick's mom confronted her angrily. Nick tried to calm things down, but his mom couldn't hear him. Annie had to handle the situation alone. She just wanted to talk to Nick, but Nick's mom slapped her. Nick then made his presence felt and told his mom about the time Annie was in his room reading his poems. He convinced his mom to let Annie see him. Annie pleaded with Nick not to leave and showed her love by placing her mom's necklace in his hand. She joined him on the bed, and as they cuddled, the invisible barrier disappeared. The real Nick woke up and called Annie's name. He told her she had done something good. She had saved him. Afterward, the scene shifts to Victor, who is playing with a toy plane. Nick appears, and they have a conversation. Victor mentions that his sister died, and Nick suggests sending her a message. Victor's message is simple: "Hey Annie." Nick writes it on the plane, and they fly it. The lesson from the story is hard to pinpoint, but it's a sad one.